The stranger rode into Rico, Colorado in the summer of 1883 with dust on his boots and a Winchester across his saddle. But what stopped him cold in the middle of Main Street was not the silver miners spilling from the saloons or the freight wagons clogging the road. It was the woman lying motionless in front of the general store while a gray-haired shopkeeper frantically waved for help. Henry Garrett swung down from his horse before the animal fully stopped, his spurs jingling as his boots hit the packed earth. The woman was young, maybe 22 or 23, with dark blonde hair that had come loose from its pins and spread across the wooden boardwalk like spilled honey. Her face was pale as milk, her lips slightly parted, and her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths that seemed too fragile to sustain life. What happened? Henry dropped to his knees beside her, his hands hovering uncertainly over her still form. "Don't know," the shopkeeper said, wringing his hands. "Miss Grace Roberts just collapsed right there. One minute she was asking about fabric, next minute she hit the floor. I carried her out here thinking the air might help, but she has not stirred." Henry pressed 2 fingers to her throat, feeling for a pulse. It fluttered weakly beneath her skin, rapid and thready like a frightened bird. Her skin burned with fever, hot enough that he jerked his hand back instinctively before forcing himself to check again. This was no fainting spell from a too tight corset. This woman was seriously ill. "She needs a doctor," Henry said. "Doc Miller is up at the mines. Cave in yesterday. He will not be back until tomorrow at the earliest." Henry looked down at the woman, at Grace, and something turned over in his chest. She had fine features, delicate but with a stubborn set to her jaw even in unconsciousness. There was a smudge of ink on her right hand, and her dress, though simple, was well made and carefully mended. Someone who took care of herself, someone who mattered. Where does she live? Boarding house on Granite Street. Mrs. Patterson's place. But Mrs. Patterson went to Durango for her sister's wedding, won't be back for a week. Henry made a decision that would change everything, though he did not know it then. "I'll take care of her." The shopkeeper's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. "You, mister, I don't even know who you are. Name is Henry Garrett. I have a room at the hotel. Help me get her there." "That is not proper. A man and a woman, unmarried, alone in a room. You see anyone else volunteering?" Henry's voice came out sharper than he intended. He gentled it. "Look, I am not going to let this woman die in the street because of propriety. You can sit outside my door with a shotgun if it makes you feel better, but we are wasting time." Between the 2 of them, they got Grace to Henry's room on the 2nd floor of the Rico Hotel. It was a simple space, nothing fancy, just a bed, a chair, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the mountains. Henry laid her on the bed as carefully as he could, then turned to the shopkeeper. "I need clean water, lots of it, cloths for cooling her down. Willow bark if you have any. You know medicine." "Enough. Learned from a Ute woman when I was younger. Fever like this, you have to bring it down or it will cook her brain." The shopkeeper, who finally introduced himself as Albert Morrison, hurried off to gather supplies. Henry pulled the chair close to the bed and really looked at Grace Roberts for the first time. She was beautiful, but it was not just her features. There was something about her that drew him, some quality he could not name. Her hands were small but capable, her nails short and practical. Working hands. He found himself wondering what her voice sounded like, what color her eyes were behind those closed lids. Albert returned with a basin of water, clean rags, and a small pouch of willow bark. Mrs. Chen at the laundry sent the bark, said to steep it in hot water for tea. "Thank her for me." Henry set about preparing the tea while cooling Grace's forehead with damp cloths. Her fever was dangerously high. He had seen men die from lesser fevers, had watched his own mother burn up with one when he was 12. That was 18 years ago, but the memory still had teeth. As the sun began to set, painting the room in shades of gold and amber, Grace's condition worsened. She began to shake, her teeth chattering despite the heat radiating from her skin. Henry piled blankets over her, then stripped them away minutes later when she started to sweat. He managed to get some of the willow bark tea down her throat, supporting her head with one hand while tipping the cup with the other. Most of it dribbled down her chin. "Come on," he whispered. "Stay with me. Don't you dare give up." Night fell. Albert Morrison came by twice to check on them, but eventually left with a promise to return in the morning. Henry found himself alone with Grace, with nothing but a coal oil lamp and his own desperate determination to keep her alive. He had never been a praying man. His father had beaten any notion of a benevolent God out of him long before his mother died. Henry knew the world was hard and cold and indifferent, knew that good people suffered while bad ones prospered, knew that there was no divine hand guiding anything. But as he sat there watching Grace Roberts struggle for each breath, he wished he knew the words, wished he could offer up something more than his own clumsy efforts. Since he had no prayers, he decided to talk instead. "My name is Henry Garrett," he began, his voice low and rough from disuse. He talked more to his horse than to people most days. "I know you cannot hear me, but I figure talking is better than sitting here silent. I rode into town this morning looking for work. I have been drifting since spring, picking up jobs here and there. Worked a cattle drive out of Texas, spent a month breaking horses in New Mexico, did some prospecting in Arizona, though I am not fool enough to think I will ever strike it rich." He refreshed the cloth on her forehead, noting with dismay that the fever had not broken. If anything, she felt hotter. "I am 29 years old, never been married, never really settled anywhere long enough to put down roots. My pa died when I was 15. He was a mean drunk and I cannot say I mourned him. My ma died when I was 12. That one I did mourn, still do some days." Grace made a small sound, almost a whimper, and Henry's heart clenched. He took her hand, careful not to squeeze too hard. Her fingers were slender and delicate in his calloused palm. "You are going to be fine," he told himself. "This fever is going to break and you are going to open your eyes and probably wonder who the hell I am and why I am holding your hand. But until then, I am right here. I am not going anywhere." Hours passed. Henry lost track of time, measured it instead in the rise and fall of Grace's chest, in the number of times he changed the cooling cloths, in the slow journey of the moon across the sky outside the window. He talked about everything and nothing. About the places he had seen, the people he had met. About his mother's garden back in Missouri, how she could make anything grow. About the time he saw the ocean in California and felt so small standing before all that water that he understood why men believed in God, even if he could not quite manage it himself. "I have never told anyone this," he said as midnight came and went, "but sometimes I get so lonely I can hardly stand it. I am around people all the time, but I am always alone. Does that make sense? Probably not. You probably have a whole passel of friends, a family that loves you. Someone like you would not understand what it is like to be on the outside looking in." He rubbed his free hand over his face, feeling the rasp of stubble. He needed to shave, needed to sleep, needed to do 100 things, but he could not bring himself to let go of her hand. "Tell me about yourself," he said, even though he knew she could not answer. "What do you do here in Rico? Albert said you were asking about fabric. You a seamstress. That would make sense with the ink on your fingers. Maybe you are a teacher. We had a teacher back in Missouri, Miss Anderson. She was kind to me even when my clothes were ragged and I could not always pay attention because I had not eaten. You seem like you would be kind like that." The fever raged on. Henry grew frantic as Grace began to thrash, her head turning from side to side, her lips moving soundlessly. He held her down as gently as he could, speaking constantly, his words running together in a desperate stream. "You have to fight this. I know you do not know me. I know I am just some stranger, but please, please fight. The world needs more people like you in it. I can tell just by looking at you that you are good, that you matter, that your loss would leave a hole. Do not give up. I am right here and I am not letting go." He talked about his horse, a sturdy bay mare named Copper. About the book he had read last winter, one of the few he owned, a collection of Walt Whitman poems that he did not entirely understand but loved anyway. About the way the sunset looked over the desert in Arizona, all purple and orange and pink like something out of a dream. "I want to show you that sunset," he said, surprised by the vehemence in his voice. "I want to show you so many things. I want to hear your voice, hear you laugh. I want to know everything about you. Your favorite color, your favorite food, what makes you happy, what makes you sad. I want to know it all." It was insane. He was losing his mind. He had known this woman for all of 8 hours, and most of that time she had been unconscious. But something had shifted inside him the moment he saw her lying on that boardwalk, and now he could not imagine walking away. Would not walk away. The darkest hours of the night crept past. Henry's voice grew hoarse from talking, but he forced himself to continue. He recited every poem he could remember, sang half-remembered songs his mother had taught him, told stories about his childhood, both true and embellished. Anything to fill the silence, to keep death at bay through sheer stubborn refusal to acknowledge it. "I think I could love you," he whispered as dawn began to paint the eastern sky gray. "I think maybe I already do, which is the craziest thing I have ever said. But sitting here all night, holding your hand, talking to you, I feel like I know you somehow. Like I have been looking for you my whole life without knowing it, and I will be damned if I am going to lose you now." He pressed her hand to his forehead, his eyes burning with exhaustion and unshed tears. "Please," he said, and it was the closest thing to a prayer he had ever offered. "Please open your eyes." For a long moment nothing happened. Then Grace's fingers twitched in his grasp. Her eyelids fluttered. Henry held his breath, afraid to hope, unable to do anything else. Grace Roberts opened her eyes. They were green, he noticed first. Green like new leaves in spring, like the river back home after the rains. They were confused at first, unfocused, but then they found his face and something like awareness crept in. "You are awake." Henry's voice cracked. "Thank God you are awake. Who are you?" Her voice was barely a whisper, rough as sandpaper, but it was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. Henry Garrett. You collapsed yesterday and there was no doctor, so I brought you to my room. You had a terrible fever. I thought I was going to lose you." Grace's brow furrowed slightly. She licked her dry lips. "Water?" "Yes, of course." Henry fumbled for the glass on the washstand, nearly knocking it over in his haste. He slid his hand behind her head, supporting her while she drank. She managed a few sips before falling back against the pillow, exhausted from even that small effort. "Thank you," she said. "How do you feel?" "Terrible. Weak, but better than I did." She paused, her eyes searching his face. "You stayed with me all night." "I did." Why? It was a fair question. Henry considered lying, offering some polite fiction about Christian duty or common decency. But after the night they had just shared, even if she had been unconscious for most of it, dishonesty felt wrong. "I could not leave you," he said simply. "From the moment I saw you, I could not leave you." Something flickered in Grace's eyes, an emotion he could not quite read. Before she could respond, a knock sounded at the door. Albert Morrison's voice came through the wood. "Mr. Garrett, how is she?" Henry crossed to the door and opened it just wide enough to speak through. "The fever broke. She is awake." Relief flooded Albert's weathered face. "Thank the Lord." Half the town has been worried sick. Grace is well loved around here." He craned his neck, trying to see past Henry into the room. "May I see her? Give her a few minutes. She is very weak." Of course, of course. I will spread the word that she is all right. Mrs. Chen will want to bring some of her soup. Nothing better for an illness than Mrs. Chen's soup." After Albert left, Henry returned to Grace's side. She was watching him with those remarkable green eyes, and he felt suddenly self-conscious. He had not looked in a mirror since yesterday morning. He probably looked like hell, unshaven and rumpled with dark circles under his eyes. "You look exhausted," Grace said, echoing his thoughts. "You should rest." "I am fine." "You are not. When was the last time you slept?" Henry had to think about it. "Night before last, I suppose." "Then you should sleep now. I am in no danger of dying in the next few hours. I would rather stay awake. Make sure you are really all right." Grace tried to smile, but it came out wan and tired. "I am not going anywhere, Henry Garrett, but you are no good to me if you collapse from exhaustion." The way she said his name, soft and careful like she was testing how it felt in her mouth, did something strange to his insides. He found himself agreeing, dragging the chair even closer to the bed before sitting down heavily. His body ached in 1,000 places from sitting in that chair all night, but he was too tired to care. "Just for a few minutes," he said. "As long as you need." Henry meant to keep his eyes open, to watch over Grace even as he rested, but exhaustion claimed him the moment he closed his eyes. He slept hard and dreamlessly, his hand still resting near Grace's on the bed, their fingers not quite touching. When he woke, sunlight was streaming through the window and the room smelled like chicken soup. Grace was propped up against the pillows, more color in her cheeks, spooning broth from a bowl with shaking hands. An older Chinese woman sat on the edge of the bed, watching Grace eat with the fierce attention of a mother hen. "He wakes," the woman said. "You are Henry Garrett. I am Mrs. Chen. You saved our Grace." "I did not do much, just kept her cool and talked to her." "You did more than you know." Mrs. Chen's dark eyes were shrewd. "Grace told me you stayed all night. That is not nothing." Henry felt heat climb up his neck. Anyone would have done the same. "No," Grace said quietly. "Not anyone. Most men would have left me at the boarding house and considered their duty done. You went beyond duty." Their eyes met and held. Something passed between them, unspoken but profound. Mrs. Chen looked from one to the other and made a satisfied sound. "I go now. Grace needs rest and you need food. I bring you something." She stood, smoothing her apron. "You are a good man, Henry Garrett. Do not let anyone tell you different." After she left, silence settled over the room. It was not uncomfortable, but it was charged with awareness. Henry stood and stretched, his joints popping. "How long was I asleep?" 4 hours, maybe 5. "It is early afternoon." "I should let you rest properly. I can go downstairs, get a different room." "No." The word came out sharp, and Grace looked surprised by her own vehemence. "I mean, you do not have to leave. This is your room after all. I am the intruder." "You are not an intruder. You are sick and you need somewhere to recover." Henry moved to the window, looking out over the street below. Rico was bustling with activity, miners and merchants going about their business. Normal life, continuing on while his own life had somehow veered onto a completely different track. "When you are feeling stronger, I will take you back to the boarding house, or wherever you want to go." "I live at the boarding house, but Mrs. Patterson is away. I suppose I could stay there alone, but honestly, I do not think I am strong enough yet to take care of myself." Henry turned to face her. "Then stay here. I will sleep in the chair or get another room, whatever makes you comfortable." "That seems like a lot of trouble." "It is no trouble at all." Grace set her soup bowl aside, her hands trembling with the effort. "Why are you doing this? You do not know me. You owe me nothing." Henry had been asking himself the same question all morning. The answer was both simple and terrifyingly complex. "I talked to you all night," he said slowly. "While you were unconscious, I told you things I have never told anyone, and somewhere in all those hours, somewhere between fear and hope, I realized I wanted to know you, the real you. I wanted to hear you talk back." He paused, measuring his words. "I know it is strange, I know it does not make sense, but I feel like I was meant to ride into Rico yesterday, meant to find you, and I am not fool enough to walk away from that." Grace was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was soft. "What did you talk about while I was unconscious?" "Everything. My childhood, my travels, things I liked, things I feared. I recited poetry and sang songs and told you stories. I talked for hours." He hesitated. "I told you I thought I could love you." Color flooded Grace's pale cheeks. "You said that to me." "I did. And I meant it. I know it is too fast, too soon. I know you have every reason to think I am insane, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life." Grace looked down at her hands, her loose hair falling forward to hide her face. When she looked up again, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I dreamed," she said, "while I was sick. I dreamed of a voice in the darkness, keeping me safe, keeping me tethered to the world when everything else wanted to drift away. I did not know who it was, but I held onto that voice like a lifeline." She smiled, tentative and wondering. "It was you. You were my lifeline." Something broke open in Henry's chest, something warm and bright and almost painful in its intensity. He crossed the room and knelt beside the bed, taking Grace's hand in both of his. "Tell me about yourself," he said. "Everything. I want to know everything." So Grace talked. She told him about growing up in Denver, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a clerk. About losing both parents to cholera when she was 19 and coming to Rico to start fresh, to escape the memories. About her work as a seamstress, the little shop she ran out of her room at the boarding house. About her love of reading, her secret ambition to write stories of her own someday. "I wanted adventure," she said with a wry smile. "I read all those dime novels about the Wild West and wanted to experience it for myself. Then I got here and realized that adventure is often just another word for hardship, but I stayed anyway. There is something about these mountains, this place. It feels like home in a way Denver never did." "I know what you mean," Henry said. "I have been drifting for years, never feeling like I belonged anywhere. But sitting here with you, I feel settled for the first time in my life." They talked through the afternoon and into the evening. Mrs. Chen brought more soup and some bread. Albert Morrison stopped by with flowers from the widow Henderson. A dozen other people came to check on Grace, and each time Henry saw the truth of what Albert had said. Grace was well loved in Rico. She had built a life here, a community. She belonged. As night fell, Henry lit the lamp and insisted that Grace try to sleep. She protested that she had been sleeping for nearly 24 hours, but her heavy eyelids betrayed her exhaustion. Within minutes of lying down, she was asleep again, her breathing deep and even. Henry returned to his chair, content to watch her sleep. He should have been bored, restless, eager to move on to the next town, the next job. Instead, he felt a profound sense of peace, like he had been searching for something his entire life and had finally found it. He must have dozed off because he woke to Grace's scream. She was thrashing in the bed, tangled in the blankets, her face contorted in terror. The fever had returned. "No," Henry breathed, pressing his hand to her forehead. She was burning up again, hotter than before. "No, no, no." He went through the same routine as the previous night, cooling cloths and willow bark tea, holding her steady when she tried to thrash, talking to her constantly. But this time was worse. Grace was delirious, crying out for her mother, begging someone named Sarah not to leave her. Her skin was so hot it seemed impossible, like touching a stove. "Stay with me," Henry pleaded, his voice breaking. "Grace, please, you have to fight. You opened your eyes once, you can do it again. Do not leave me, please do not leave me." The night stretched on endlessly. Henry found himself bargaining with a God he did not believe in, promising anything, everything, if Grace would just survive. He would give up drinking, give up gambling, devote his life to good works. Whatever it took. "I love you," he said as the darkest hours crept past. "I know it is crazy, but I love you. I have loved you since I saw you lying on that boardwalk. I love your green eyes and your gentle hands and the way you said my name. I love how everyone in this town speaks of you with such fondness. I love that you came to Rico looking for adventure. I love you, Grace Roberts, and I am begging you to stay. Please stay." Just before dawn, Grace went still. For one horrible moment, Henry thought she was gone. Then he saw the slight rise of her chest, felt the flutter of her pulse. She was alive, but barely. He pressed his forehead to their joined hands and let himself cry great silent sobs that shook his whole body. "I do not know how to pray," he said brokenly. "I do not know the words, but I am saying every word I have. Every word I know, every thought in my head, every feeling in my heart. I am giving it all to you, Grace. Please let it be enough. Please let it be enough." As the sun broke over the mountains, painting the peaks in shades of gold and rose, Grace's eyelids fluttered. Her grip on his hand tightened just barely, but enough. Henry held his breath. Grace opened her eyes. "Henry," she whispered, "I am here. I am right here. I heard you. I heard everything you said. You did." "Yes, and Henry," she smiled, weak but genuine, "I love you too." After that, Grace's recovery was steady. The fever did not return. Over the next few days, she grew stronger, able to sit up for longer periods, to eat solid food, to walk around the room with Henry's support. Dr. Miller finally returned from the mines and confirmed what Henry already knew. Grace had survived the worst of a severe infection, likely from a cut that had gone bad. She was lucky to be alive. "She is alive because of you," Dr. Miller told Henry. "Whatever you did, it worked. You have my admiration, Mr. Garrett." A week after Grace first collapsed, she was well enough to leave the hotel. Henry half expected her to go back to the boarding house, to return to her normal life and leave him behind. Instead, she asked if he would walk with her to her shop. It was a beautiful late summer day, warm but not hot, with a breeze that carried the scent of pine from the mountains. Grace's shop was a small room on the ground floor of Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, with a window facing the street and a sign that read Grace's Alterations and Fine Sewing. Inside, the space was neat and organized despite a week of neglect. A dress form stood in one corner, half-finished projects were stacked on a table, and shelves along the walls held bolts of fabric in every color imaginable. Grace moved around the room, touching things gently, reacquainting herself with her own space. "I was working on Mrs. Henderson's daughter's wedding dress when I got sick," she said, picking up a length of white silk. "The wedding is in 3 weeks. I need to finish it. Then you will finish it. You are strong enough now." Grace set the silk down and turned to face him. "What happens now, Henry, between us?" It was the question he had been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. "I do not know. I know what I want, but I do not know if it is what you want." "What do you want?" Henry took a breath, steadying himself. "I want to stay in Rico. I want to court you properly, take you to dinner, walk you home, meet your friends. I want to build something with you, a life, a future. I want to marry you someday if you will have me. I want all of it. You would give up drifting, settle down here in a heartbeat. I have been looking for a reason to stop running. You are that reason." Grace crossed the room and took his hands in hers. "I want all of that too. But Henry, we barely know each other. We spent a week together while I was sick." That is hardly a foundation for a life. Then we will build the foundation. Take our time, do it right. I am not going anywhere, you promise? I promise. Grace stood on her tiptoes and kissed him, soft and brief but full of promise. When she pulled back, she was smiling. Then we have a lot to learn about each other. Henry Garrett. The courtship that followed was unlike anything Henry had ever experienced. He found work at the livery stable, mucking out stalls and caring for horses, honest work that paid enough for a room and meals. Every evening, he would wash up and put on his cleanest shirt and call on Grace at the boarding house, where Mrs. Patterson, who had returned from Durango full of gossip and wedding cake, chaperoned with eagle-eyed vigilance. They talked endlessly, discovering each other in layers. Grace loved thunderstorms and hated spiders. She could play the piano, though she had not touched one since leaving Denver. She was terrible at cooking but excellent at baking. She dreamed of traveling to San Francisco someday, seeing the ocean, maybe writing a book about her adventures. Henry told her about his childhood in more detail, the poverty and the violence and the small moments of beauty that had kept him going. About his mother's garden and his father's fists. About the years of drifting, the loneliness that had become so familiar he had almost stopped noticing it. About how she had changed everything. They went on picnics in the mountains, walked along the river that ran through Rico, attended church socials and town dances. Henry met Grace's friends, was welcomed into the community that had embraced her. He discovered that he liked being part of something, belonging somewhere. Rico began to feel like home. 3 months after Grace collapsed on the boardwalk, Henry asked her to marry him. They were sitting on the porch of the boarding house, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold. Henry had planned a whole speech, something eloquent and romantic, but when the moment came, all he could manage was the truth. Marry me, Grace. I love you more than I thought it was possible to love another person. Marry me and let me spend the rest of my life making you happy. Grace did not hesitate. Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes. They were married in the Rico church on a crisp October day with half the town in attendance. Grace wore a dress she had made herself, simple but beautiful, and carried wildflowers that Mrs. Chen had gathered from the mountains. Henry wore a new suit that Grace had insisted on making for him, his first new clothes in years. He felt like a different person from the drifter who had rode into town 3 months earlier. He was a different person. The wedding celebration lasted well into the night, with music and dancing and more food than Henry had seen in one place. But his favorite moment was near the end, when he and Grace slipped away from the crowd and stood together under the stars. "Are you happy?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible," Grace said, leaning back against him. "You. More than you can imagine. Tell me something I do not know about you." Henry thought for a moment. "I still do not know any prayers. I still do not believe in God, not really. But that night when I thought I was losing you, I learned that love is its own kind of prayer. That's saying every word you have, pouring out your whole heart, that is as holy as anything in a church." Grace turned in his arms to face him. "You saved my life with those words, with your love. You saved mine too. Before you, I was just existing, not really living. You gave me a reason to put down roots, to build something instead of just drifting from place to place." They kissed under the stars, husband and wife, 2 people who had found each other against impossible odds and built something beautiful from it. The first year of their marriage was an adjustment. Henry and Grace moved into a small house on the edge of town, a 2-room cabin that they slowly made their own. Grace set up her sewing business in one corner of the main room, while Henry continued working at the livery stable. Money was tight, but they had enough, and what they lacked in material wealth, they made up for in happiness. They learned each other's rhythms and quirks. Grace was not a morning person and was barely coherent before coffee. Henry snored when he slept on his back. Grace organized everything obsessively, while Henry was content with a certain level of chaos. They bickered over small things and laughed over smaller ones. They made love with the passionate intensity of newlyweds and the growing tenderness of deepening intimacy. In their second spring together, Grace discovered she was pregnant. The news filled them both with joy and terror in equal measure. They had talked about children in an abstract way, someday plans, but someday had arrived with startling speed. What if I am a terrible mother? Grace worried, her hands resting on her still flat stomach. What if I do not know what to do? Then we will figure it out together, Henry assured her, just like we have figured out everything else. The pregnancy was difficult. Grace suffered from terrible nausea in the early months, then swelling and exhaustion as she grew larger. Henry did everything he could to help, taking over the cooking and cleaning, rubbing her aching feet, holding her when she cried from frustration and discomfort. "I am sorry," she said one night, tears streaming down her face. "I am so tired and miserable, and I am taking it out on you." "You are growing a whole person inside you," Henry said, wiping away her tears. "You are allowed to be tired and miserable. And you could never take anything out on me that I could not handle." Their daughter was born on a cold November night, a month before Grace was due. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Henry feared he would lose them both. He paced the small cabin while Mrs. Chen and Dr. Miller worked, remembering another night when he had feared losing Grace, when he had poured out every word he had to keep her alive. He found himself doing it again, whispering prayers that were not quite prayers, bargaining with the universe for their safety. When he finally heard his daughter's cry, thin and indignant, he nearly collapsed with relief. Mrs. Chen emerged from the bedroom, a tiny bundle in her arms. "You have a daughter," she said, placing the baby in Henry's arms. "Small but healthy. And Grace is tired but well." Henry looked down at his daughter and felt his heart expand impossibly. She was tiny, red-faced and wrinkled, with a surprising amount of dark hair. She was perfect. Grace was pale and exhausted when he brought the baby to her, but her smile was radiant. "Hello, little one," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Hello, sweetheart. What should we name her?" Henry asked. Grace had thought about this. "Hope. I want to name her Hope, because that is what you gave me that night when I was sick. Hope when there was every reason to despair." "Hope Garrett," Henry said, testing the name. "It is perfect." Raising Hope was the hardest and most rewarding thing either of them had ever done. She was a fussy baby who rarely slept, who seemed to cry at the slightest provocation. Henry and Grace took turns walking her at night, singing to her, rocking her, trying everything to soothe her. There were times when they were so exhausted they could barely function, when they snapped at each other over nothing, when they wondered if they were cut out for parenthood. But there were also moments of profound joy. Hope's first smile, which she gave to Grace at 6 weeks old, the way she would quiet when Henry sang to her, even though his voice was rough and off-key. The first time she laughed, a sound so delightful that both Henry and Grace immediately did whatever had caused it over and over just to hear it again. As Hope grew from infant to toddler, her personality emerged. She was stubborn like her mother and adventurous like her father, a combination that kept Henry and Grace constantly on their toes. She learned to walk early and immediately used her newfound mobility to get into everything. She had no fear, climbing on furniture, running toward horses, trying to touch the hot stove despite repeated warnings. "She is going to give us gray hair before we are 35, Grace said one evening after rescuing Hope from yet another dangerous situation. "She is spirited," Henry said diplomatically. "She is a menace." But Grace was smiling when she said it, watching Hope toddle around the room with a wooden horse Henry had carved for her. Despite the challenges, or maybe because of them, their love for their daughter was absolute and unwavering. When Hope was 2, Grace discovered she was pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, perhaps because Grace knew what to expect, or perhaps because she was too busy chasing a toddler to focus on her discomfort. Their son was born on a warm June day, coming into the world with far less drama than his sister. They named him Harrison, after Henry's maternal grandfather, a man Henry had barely known but whose kindness Henry's mother had often spoken of. Harrison was everything Hope was not: calm, easygoing, content to observe the world rather than immediately conquering it. He slept through the night at 8 weeks old and rarely cried. Next to Hope's constant motion, Harrison seemed almost unnaturally serene. "Are we sure he is ours?" Grace joked, watching Harrison nap peacefully while Hope destroyed a stack of fabric scraps nearby. "He is perfect," Henry said. "They both are." The years passed in a blur of small moments that added up to a life. Hope's first day of school, where she immediately befriended every child in her class. Harrison's quiet intensity as he learned to read, sounding out words with careful precision. Family picnics in the mountains. Christmas mornings around the small tree that Henry chopped down each year. Birthdays and anniversaries and ordinary Tuesdays that were made extraordinary simply by being together. Grace's sewing business thrived. She became known throughout the region for her skill, with people traveling from as far as Durango to have her make their wedding dresses and Sunday best. Henry eventually bought the livery stable from its aging owner, building it into a successful business. They were not rich, would never be rich, but they were comfortable. More importantly, they were happy. When Hope was 8 and Harrison was 6, Grace's old dream of writing resurfaced. She started scribbling stories in the evenings after the children were in bed, tales of adventure and romance set in the mountains she loved. Henry encouraged her, reading her drafts and offering suggestions, marveling at her talent. "You should try to get these published," he said after reading her latest story. Who would publish stories by a seamstress from Rico, Colorado? Someone with sense. "These are good, Grace. Really good." Grace did submit her stories, sending them to publishers in New York and San Francisco. The rejections came regularly, but she persisted, writing new stories, refining her craft. Finally, when Hope was 10, a publisher accepted one of her stories for a magazine. The payment was small, only $5, but Grace treasured that check like it was made of gold. More acceptances followed. Grace never became famous, but she built a modest reputation as a writer of Western tales. She published under her own name, Grace Garrett, and took pride in seeing it in print. Henry was fiercely proud of her, showing her published stories to anyone who would look. "That is my wife," he would say, his chest puffed up with pride. "She is a published author." The children grew. Hope developed a passion for horses, spending hours at the livery stable with Henry, learning everything he could teach her. Harrison discovered a love of music, teaching himself to play the piano in the church, and eventually the fiddle that Henry bought him for his 12th birthday. They were good kids, kind and thoughtful, growing into the sort of people who made their parents proud. On their 15th wedding anniversary, Henry and Grace left the children with Mrs. Chen and took a trip to the mountains, camping under the stars like they had talked about doing for years, but never quite managed. They rode up into the high country where the air was thin and clean, and the only sounds were the wind in the pines and the call of distant birds. That night, lying in their bedroll under more stars than seemed possible, Grace turned to Henry. "You remember the night we met, when I was sick?" Every detail. It was the most terrifying night of my life. You said you did not know any prayers, but you said every word you had. Do you remember? Of course. I have thought about that so many times over the years, about how you loved me before you even knew me, about how your words, your presence, your refusal to give up, all of that saved my life. Grace propped herself up on one elbow to look at him. I want you to know that every day since then has been a gift. This life we built, our children, our home, all of it. It is more than I ever dreamed of. And it all started because a stranger refused to let me die. Henry reached up to cup her face. You saved me too. Before you, I was lost. I did not even know how lost until I found you. They made love under the stars, slow and tender, celebrating 15 years of marriage, 15 years of building a life together. Afterward, Grace fell asleep in Henry's arms, and he lay awake watching her, marveling at how much she still looked like the woman he had first seen on that boardwalk, but also how much she had changed. There were fine lines around her eyes now, threads of silver in her hair. She had born and raised 2 children, built a business, pursued her dreams. She was even more beautiful to him now than she had been at 23. When Hope turned 16, she announced that she wanted to train horses professionally. Henry was delighted and immediately began teaching her everything he knew, which led to her working alongside him at the stable. She had a gift for it, a natural way with even the most difficult horses. Within a year, people were specifically requesting that Hope work with their animals. Harrison, meanwhile, discovered a talent for composing music. The simple folk songs and hymns he had started with evolved into complex original pieces. When he was 17, a music teacher passing through Rico heard him play and encouraged him to study in Denver. It was a difficult decision, sending their son away, but Henry and Grace knew they could not hold him back from his dreams. The day they put Harrison on the stage to Denver, Grace cried. "He is so young," she said, clutching Henry's hand. "He is the same age you were when you came to Rico," Henry reminded her. "And look how that turned out. That is what worries me." But Harrison thrived in Denver. He wrote home regularly, long letters full of excitement about his studies and the city. He came home for Christmas and summers, filling the house with new music, and they could see him growing into himself, becoming the man he was meant to be. Hope stayed in Rico, eventually taking over the livery stable when Henry decided to semi-retire at 55. She married a young prospector named Thomas Wheeler, and Grace made her wedding dress, crying through the entire fitting process. "My baby is getting married," Grace said, sniffling. "I am 23, Ma, hardly a baby. You will always be my baby." Hope and Thomas settled in Rico, building a house not far from Henry and Grace. When Hope gave birth to her first child, a daughter she named Grace after her mother, the circle felt complete. Henry held his granddaughter and thought about the night he had held Hope for the first time, about all the years in between, about how a single decision to help a stranger had led to all of this. Harrison eventually returned to Rico after finishing his studies. He had offers to stay in Denver, to teach or perform, but he missed the mountains, missed his family. He came home and became the music teacher at the school, teaching a generation of Rico children to love music the way he did. He married a kind woman named Ellen, a teacher, and they had 3 children who filled the house with noise and laughter. As Henry and Grace grew older, they settled into a comfortable rhythm. They sold the livery stable to Hope and lived on the proceeds along with Grace's writing income, which had grown steadier over the years. They spent their days reading, gardening, entertaining grandchildren. They watched Rico grow and change, welcoming the railroad, weathering economic booms and busts, seeing friends age and pass on, On their 40th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a party. The whole town came, it seemed, filling the church hall with food and music and well wishes. People told stories about Henry and Grace, about their kindness and generosity, about how they were the heart of the community. Henry looked around at the gathering, at his children and grandchildren, at the friends they had made over 4 decades, at Grace, still beautiful to him, still the center of his world. He thought about the drifter he had been, lonely and lost, and marveled at the transformation. All because he had stopped to help a woman who needed him. Late that night, after everyone had gone home and they were alone in the house they had shared for so many years, Grace took his hand. "Dance with me," she said. "There is no music. We do not need music." So they danced in the kitchen, swaying gently in the lamplight, holding each other close. After a while, Grace spoke. "Thank you," she said. "For what? For stopping that day. For staying with me. For saying every word you had until I opened my eyes. For loving me all these years. For giving me this life." Henry kissed her forehead. "Thank you for opening your eyes, for loving me back, for making me believe I deserved happiness, for being my home." They stood there swaying, two people who had found each other in the unlikeliest of circumstances and built something beautiful. Outside, Rico slept under the stars. Inside, Henry and Grace held each other and were grateful. The years continued to pass. They celebrated 50th, then 60th wedding anniversaries. They became great-grandparents, watching their family tree spread and grow. Grace published a collection of her stories, seeing her life's work bound in a single volume. Henry taught his grandchildren and great-grandchildren about horses, passing on knowledge that would outlive him. They grew frail with age, their bodies failing even as their love remained strong. There were aches and pains, illnesses and injuries, the inevitable decline that comes with living a long life. But they faced it together, just as they had faced everything else. When Henry was 87 and Grace was 85, Grace fell ill again. It was not as sudden or dramatic as that first illness 62 years earlier, but it was no less serious. Pneumonia, the doctor said. At her age, it was dangerous. Henry sat by her bedside, holding her hand just as he had that first night. But this time Grace was conscious, able to talk to him even though each breath was labored. "I am not afraid," she told him. "We had a good life, a beautiful life." "The best life," Henry agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "You remember what you said to me that first night, when I was sick?" "I said a lot of things. You said you thought you could love me, that you already did." Grace smiled, her green eyes still bright despite her illness. "I fell in love with that voice in the darkness before I ever saw your face, and I have loved you every day since." "I love you more now than I did then," Henry said. "I did not know it was possible to love someone this much. You are my whole world, Grace, and you are mine." They sat together in silence for a while, communicating in the wordless way of people who have spent a lifetime together. Finally, Grace spoke again. "If I do not make it through this, do not talk like that. Listen to me, Henry Garrett. If I do not make it, I want you to know that I have no regrets. Not one. You gave me everything I could have wanted and more. You made me happier than I had any right to be. You are not leaving me, not yet. We have more time." Grace squeezed his hand weakly. "I hope so. I would like more time. But if not, know that I love you. Know that you were the greatest adventure of my life." But Grace, stubborn and strong even in her 80s, fought off the pneumonia. She recovered slowly but surely, and soon enough, she was back to her old self, if a bit more fragile. They had 5 more years together, 5 precious years of watching the family continue to grow, of quiet mornings and peaceful evenings, of a love that had only deepened with time. Henry died first, at 92, peacefully in his sleep with Grace beside him. He simply did not wake up one morning, slipping away as gently as a sigh. Grace grieved deeply, but found comfort in their children and grandchildren, in the life they had built, in the memories they had made. She lived 2 more years, filling her time with family and writing. Her last story, published just months before she died, was about a drifter who found his home in the most unexpected way. She dedicated it to Henry, to the man who had said every word he had until she opened her eyes, to the love of her life. Grace passed away quietly at 92, surrounded by family, her last words a whispered, "I am coming, Henry. Wait for me." They were buried side by side in the Rico cemetery, under the mountains they had loved. Their headstone was simple: Henry Garrett, 1854–1946, and Grace Garrett, 1860–1952. Beloved husband and wife, parents, grandparents, together forever. Their descendants continue to live in Rico and beyond, carrying forward the legacy of love and family that Henry and Grace had built. The story of how they met became family legend, passed down through generations. The cowboy who did not know any prayers but said every word he had all night until she opened her eyes, and the woman who loved him for it. Hope's granddaughter, visiting Rico for the first time as a young woman, stood at their grave and read the inscription. She had heard the stories all her life, about the great-great-grandparents who had loved each other so completely, who had built something beautiful from nothing. "Thank you," she whispered to the stone, to the memory of 2 people she had never met but who had shaped her existence. "Thank you for finding each other. Thank you for choosing love." The wind rustled through the pines, carrying the scent of the mountains, and somewhere in that wind, maybe, were 2 souls still dancing in the kitchen, still holding hands under the stars, still together after all these years. The cowboy who learned that love was its own kind of prayer, and the woman who taught him that every word mattered, especially the one spoken from the heart. Their love story had started with a stranger stopping to help someone in need, with a long night of desperate words and stubborn hope, with eyes opening to see someone who would become everything. It had grown through shared moments and challenges overcome, through children raised and dreams pursued, through 40 years and 50 years and 60 years of choosing each other every single day. And in the end, it became something eternal, not just a marriage but a legacy. Not just 2 lives intertwined, but a foundation for generations to come. All because a cowboy who did not know any prayers said every word he had until she opened her eyes, and she loved him for it. The sun set over Rico, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple, the same colors Henry and Grace had watched thousands of times together. The town had changed in the century since they met, grown and modernized, but the mountains remained, eternal and unchanging, keeping watch over a love story that had started on a dusty boardwalk in 1883 and would echo through the ages. In the gathering twilight, the wind carried whispers of old words spoken in desperation and love, of promises made and kept, of 2 souls who found each other against all odds and built a life so beautiful it seemed like a prayer answered, even for a man who claimed not to know any prayers at all. Because in the end, Henry had been wrong about that. He had known the most important prayer of all, love spoken in every word he had, until the one he loved opened her eyes and loved him back. And that was enough. That was everything. That was a life well lived, a love well earned, a story worth telling until the mountains themselves crumbled to dust. The story of Henry and Grace, the cowboy and the seamstress, 2 people who proved that sometimes the greatest adventures start with the simplest act of kindness, and the deepest prayers are the ones spoken from a heart that refuses to give up hope.